Welcome to the second session of the morning and our second session on authenticity. Since it's such an important and potentially controversial topic, we need to think about it a bit more. We're going to get a little more theoretical grounding for the topic with Robert McNamara, and then we'll have some practical applications of the topic from John Henry Crosby and Daniel Schreck. And after that, hopefully we'll have lots of time for further discussion. As you're thinking of questions or things you want to discuss, feel free to call on the people who spoke on the first session as well. We can all discuss this in detail. All right.
So I'm going to speak on Edith Stein's understanding of personal authenticity. Now, though to my knowledge, she doesn't use the term authenticity too frequently throughout her writings, she does often speak about the conceptual content of this. And so she has much to say on personal authenticity, particularly or especially when understanding human formation. Now, to appreciate what she says on personal authenticity, we have to step back and look at her understanding of unfolding. So for Stein, all finite being is an unfolding of meaning, a spatial, temporal unfolding of meaning. And this unfolding is an unfurling and disclosing of the essence of the finite being, and that can be understood as the progressive manifestation of divine thought about this being in the world. So all finite being is unfurling and disclosing in a process of unfolding, and this is a further manifestation of divine thought about that being. Now, the human being, as a finite being, is also unfolding through the course of time and in space. However, human unfolding is unfolding to a higher degree and according to a higher way, precisely because we are not merely a bodily natural being, but a spiritual personal being. So precisely as personal, human unfolding is something that happens according to a higher way. Now, whereas bodily or natural unfolding in finite being happens to the being, happens in the being, is something that naturally progresses, spiritual or personal unfolding is something that the personal individual must choose, must consciously choose to engage in. And therefore, it's something that involves rational freedom. Now, for Stein, this unfolding of the human being as a personal being is not merely the formation of the body, like all natural living being, but is a shaping of the soul and an unfolding of personal living. A shaping of the soul and an unfolding of personal living. Now, to appreciate what Stein means by that, I'm going to take an extended quote, and then we're going to try and unpack it a little bit. So in your reading pack, on the second page of the reading from Stein, which is taken from the penultimate chapter of Finite and Eternal Being, Stein's last major philosophical work in her magnus opus, and it's page 103 in your reading pack, we have a lengthy quotation. The second last paragraph, beginning, having said this, and I'll start in the second sentence. The soul is the space in the middle of the whole body, soul, spirit. As sensitive, the soul dwells in the body, in all its members and parts. It receives from the body, and it affects the body by shaping and conserving it. And so this is the unfolding of the soul in bodily formation, something that happens in all living bodily being. However, as spiritual, the soul rises above itself, sees into a world beyond its own self, a world of things, persons, and events. And by understanding it, interacts with it, and receives from it. But the soul in its most proper sense dwells in its own home. The personal I is at home in the soul. All that enters from the world of the senses and from the world of the spirit accumulates in the soul. This is where the give and take with the world goes on. This is where the I takes its stance on the world and whence it gains what is to become its most personal possession, a part of its very self, what figuratively speaking becomes its flesh and blood. So one can think of this as like the body has its nourishment, the soul has its nourishment. Inasmuch as bodily nourishment builds up the body, this kind of spiritual nourishment builds up the soul. It's a sensitive and spiritual kind of nourishment. The soul described by our Holy Mother Teresa, that's Teresa of Avila, as an interior castle, is not a point like the pure eye, it is a space, indeed a castle with many dwellings. The eye can move about freely in the castle of its soul, now moving outwards, now drawing back into its interior. But the castle is not an empty space, even though a fullness can enter into it and be taken up into it. Indeed, this receiving must take place if the soul is to unfold its very own life. The soul cannot live without receiving. It nourishes itself from the contents that it takes in spiritually by experiencing them. Just as the body nourishes itself by processing the material that it takes up, so too the soul. But this image of the body, more clearly than an image of space, makes the point that it is more than a question of filling a void. Rather, that which is taken in has an essence all its own, an ousia, and that in its own way it takes in and shapes what it takes in into itself. It is the essence of the soul, together with the properties and abilities rooted in its essence, that opens up in these experiences and takes in what it needs in order to become what it is meant to be. This essence, with its distinctive identity, leaves its own particular stamp on the body, as well as on all its personally spiritual activity. Moreover, it streams forth from the body in a way both unconscious and unwilled. Now, what we have here is the personal I that is present to the world in conscious awareness and present to itself, to its own interior. And this interior is a sensitive and spiritual expanse within which the personal I dwells. But it's not an expanse like a void, an empty warehouse that simply takes in what is received via the powers of reason, will, and spiritual affection. No, it's a castle, an interior castle. And that interior castle has its own peculiar shape, its own color and texture, its own manifold of rooms. And when the personal I engages from that dwelling place with the exterior world via reason, will, and spiritual affectivity, that castle begins to unfold through the course of time. It begins to take its proper shape over the course of time. But only if one lives life in an authentically personal manner. Now, what does it mean for Stein to live in an authentically personal manner? It means to live as oneself by living from the depth of one's soul, living as oneself more and more deeply in this interior castle. And when one lives more and more deeply in this interior castle, the castle unfolds according to its proper shape, its proper proportion. And it's doing so in primarily three ways: via the power of reason encountering the truth of the world, via the power of the will striving after the good therein found, and via the powers of spiritual affectivity whereby the soul is deeply moved by the goodness, beauty, and truth of the world. And it's in this engagement with the world, living from the depth of the interior, that the spiritual soul unfolds according to its proper meaning. Now, what you see here is that the personal I, in dwelling interiorly, isn't removing him or herself from the world. Rather, the more interiorly the personal I dwells in the interior expanse of the soul, the more that personal I is engaged in the world according to its truth, goodness, and beauty. Living more deeply, one sees more clearly, understands more fully, and chooses more vigorously. So this retraction into the interior isn't a retraction from the world, but is that precisely whereby we begin to live in the world as what we are as human. Now, what we begin to see here is that each person has a responsibility to take upon themselves, consciously and freely, the choice to allow this spiritual interior to unfold. And so in a real sense, the person is a creator of that spiritual interior. And yet at the same time, we can more precisely say that they're a co-creator, precisely because this spiritual interior is unfolding. It's something already given to the personal individual, something given to this individual by the personal God to be unfolded in a personal way that is rationally and freely. So it is something really given, and therefore only a co-creation, but a creation nonetheless. A cooperative activity with the Creator who has bestowed upon the individual this peculiar shape of the interior. And this cooperation with the Creator is worked out precisely by engaging in the world, its truth, goodness, and beauty. Now that's worth hovering on for a moment, precisely to bring this back to our understanding of the moral life and virtue. For Stein, the person is correlated with value. And one discovers who one is as a person, and one becomes who one is meant to become as a person precisely in the encounter with value. In the encounter with value, more and more of that interior space, you could say, is unlocked. And only in the encounter with value is that interior space unlocked. And so we see here that for Stein, personal authenticity, if not a virtue, is something that in a way, like Dr. Crosby said earlier, is the intimate interior of all virtue, or the moral life taken in completion. That is, to live authentically is to live fully as oneself, and also at the same time to be a moral individual, engaged properly with value that's simultaneously unlocking the interior. And so, to summarize, for Stein, the human person is unfolding through the course of time, just like all natural creaturely being, but precisely as personal, unfolds in a spiritual manner. Unlike the happening of bodily unfolding, this personal spiritual unfolding is something that must be consciously chosen, and so each individual has a responsibility to do so. And this then is to live authentically as oneself. And that authenticity is brought about precisely in the encounter with value, whereby the interior space is mined or unfolding according to its proper character, its proper shape. Now, so far what we've spoken about is something that is metaphysically coherent with a Thomistic understanding of the soul and body, of the spirit, soul, body composite that we are. That is, each personal individual has the responsibility to live life in a rational and free way as a person. But Stein introduces the further element of the interior castle to give an interior depth to that understanding, and then also introduces the further element that the interior is something peculiar, something unique to each individual, and something unrepeatable by divine fiat. And so not only do we have this responsibility as a personal I, this human subject, but also according to the distinctiveness that we each are as this personal subject. And Stein usefully employs the metaphor of color for this. Each of us are humanly identical as personal spirits, and yet at the same time we're distinctively determined, uniquely colored, and we then represent a spectrum that a prism has refracted of the divine light. Each person uniquely reflects something of God's nature, and that's the person's most proper possession, and something that we all ultimately should encounter if we live life according to personal authenticity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Can you all hear me? Okay. So in the reading packet, I had assigned a chapter from Charles Taylor's book on the ethics of authenticity, but I've decided to take up a different theme in this discussion of authenticity. I'd like to present to you all, to unpack for you, a wonderful essay of Romano Guardini called On the Acceptance of Oneself. And the way the essay is not specifically an exploration of authenticity. He doesn't use the word either. But I think that what he has to say about the acceptance of oneself gets to the very core of what authenticity would be. In fact, if one can achieve the kind of acceptance of oneself that Guardini describes, one would, I think, already be sort of structurally disposed or already living in a profoundly authentic way. And the other thing that I want to sort of lead into as we take up Guardini's essay here is the respect in which the essay addresses not just the natural order through which authenticity happens in the engagement with values, but it also addresses in some sense the metaphysical situation of the person in a fallen world in which there is profound disorder. He doesn't work this out in a fully theological way, but it's very clear that he's describing an experience of fallen man and the kind of struggles that that produces. So I'm going to take maybe a slightly different tack than other presentations so far. What I'd like to do is, in some sense, sort of walk you through episodically through Guardini's essay, in part by reading some passages. Unfortunately, it's not translated, and so I'm depending a little bit on some translations that my father has made. I've translated some other passages for today, and I'm happy to share those for those who would be interested afterwards. So let me begin with sort of the first episode, the opening episode of his brief essay, which, by the way, is only 30 pages long, and it's one of those essays in which the 30 pages are, they have a great simplicity and clarity, and yet the depth of those 30 pages, I think, greatly exceeds what ordinarily can be communicated so efficiently. So Guardini begins with what one might call our two original experiences of the givenness of myself. And so what does he mean? He means that in every experience of thinking, doing, acting, feeling, there is always, I myself am always implicit in that experience. It's always my experience, my action, my feeling. And he thinks that even when you move into more objective categories, if you try to use words like world or country, in many instances, the implication or what one means is my country or the world that I inhabit. And he even says that if you attempt to abstract even further, let's just say in a kind of metaphysical way, he thinks that that insofar as, insofar as it is myself that I'm trying to step beyond, I'm still encompassed somehow in these thoughts. So it's not, the argument is not that I can't come to objective knowledge of the world, but simply that I am always given to myself in ways that become very invisible, but in ways in which I am always implied. And so he describes the self in this context as the living pole of the world. The world exists for me as one in which I act. A world in which I'm not a part exists only as a pure hypothesis. He makes the intriguing point that once I come to be, there really is no world in which I do not exist, putting aside hypothetical worlds. And that gives, as he says, a kind of necessity to one's existence once one comes into the world. And so he speaks of the I having an inescapable character. Now, if on the one hand, this is the kind of I that has a kind of clarity and obviousness once it's identified, there's perhaps no mystery to it yet, Guardini also notices another givenness of the I, which he describes as much more mysterious, even strange, unknown to myself. And he uses the example of when we stand in front of a mirror and perhaps catch our own glance. And the feeling that surely all of us have had before when we look at that person in the mirror and we say, that's me. Is that me? Who am I? And so he begins to push back on this idea of the simple givenness of myself in all experience, and to recognize that there's this other respect in which my I is mysterious and impenetrable. And so he says, initially we found that to say I am my own given had meant that I myself am self-evident, primary, the basis of all experience. All things refer back to this I. But now this sentence also means I am not an I by nature, but I am given to myself. I have received myself. Let me just unpack that a little further. He goes on to say, at the beginning of my existence, beginning understood not just temporarily, but essentially as the root and ground of my existence, we do not find my own decision to exist, Much less am I simply here as if I do not need to be brought into being. All this only applies to God. Rather, at the beginning of my existence stands an initiative, a someone who has given me to myself. Not simply as a human being, but given to myself as this person, belonging to this people, this time, with these dispositions, with the ultimate particularities that exist only in the singular, namely in myself. So he begins to identify this respect in which when we discover ourselves, we realize that in some sense we are given to ourselves, handed over to ourselves. And he'll begin to work this out now in this essay with this perhaps more mysterious sense of the I that we can identify. So he speaks of a great task. Once we understand that we are given to ourselves, he says, I find a very great task, perhaps even the task that underlies all other tasks. And here we get sort of to the core assertion of the essay. He says, I should want to be who I am, really want to be myself, and just myself. I should stand within myself as I am and take up this task. We can also express this negatively. I must not evade what has been assigned to me, like when I dream of being someone else, imagining myself to be this or that person, doing this or that, having this or that ability, playing various roles. This vicariousness is quite harmless up to a point, relieving us of our solitude, but it quickly turns into the danger of running away from oneself. Nor may we run away from what is bad in me, bad dispositions, deep-rooted habits, the accumulation of guilt. I have to accept these and stand by them. This is how I am. This is what I have done. I must not stand with myself defiantly, which is not acceptance, but a hardening of oneself, but in the light of truth, because truth is the only path that will lead me out of evil. So you begin to see that what he means by self-acceptance isn't simply a kind of uncritical acceptance where we choose to accept only certain things about ourselves, or an acceptance that is passive to one's weaknesses, but an acceptance that begins by recognizing who we really are and not trying to solve the problem of our lives by wishing we were something else or trying to sort of step out of ourselves into solutions that would really be the solutions or the life of someone else. Now, there's a wonderful passage here in which he sort of pushes more deeply into, you might call it the mystery of the I, that I wanted to share with you. And it makes I think we're still at this point at the level of what you might say, what one might call philosophical inquiry. I think there's a kind of momentum in this essay you'll see from philosophy into theology, but this here, I think, is something one could still broadly assert. So he says, to the question, why am I as I am? Why do I exist rather than not at all? There is no answer to be found in my own immediate being. Nor does the answer lie in my surroundings, not even in the world itself. All attempts to explain me on the basis of prior conditions in the community, history, nature are mistaken, for these explanations speak to the general relation of material, biological, and historical causes. But the question at issue here is quite different. It focuses on something which only exists in the singular, namely myself. And not because I am particularly important or extraordinary, but simply because I am myself, which precludes any classification into general categories. To the question, why exactly is it me on whom this or that influence works? To this, there is no answer. All this means I cannot explain myself, but must accept myself. And the clarity and the courage with which I do forms the basis of my entire existence. So I want to offset anything that sounds here as if there's just a kind of static accepting of oneself. The idea here is that the acceptance is the beginning of the project of our lives. But then beyond it, it's a fascinating assertion that no purely material question can ultimately address the extraordinary concreteness and individuality of the person, and that all answers that can be found somehow will fall short. I mean, they may begin to explain in different ways. He makes the interesting observation that we think we can explain things in these material ways. So for example, if we ask ourselves, why did something happen to a friend of mine? And we can say, well, they made this mistake and they had this upbringing and their parents raised them in the following way and they experienced these hardships. And it all seems very simple, like we've explained someone's life and the inner workings of their life. But as soon as you direct those same examples onto ourselves and we say, why am I this way? All of those explanations in the end somehow elude offering the final account of why we are as we are. Now, he goes on to make a very interesting comment, which again, I think one could assert in a theological way. It might not be the most appealing thing to some people, which is that there's an aesthetical dimension right at the outside of this project, which is the acceptance of myself. So he says, thus, the act of being oneself is aesthetical in its root. I must renounce the desire to be other than I am, let alone to want to be someone other than myself. I must do without talents that have not been granted to me, to recognize my limits, and to remain within them. But this does not mean renouncing all aspiration for growth. This I can and should pursue, but within the parameters that have been given to me. I must not fall into resentment, which would reveal that I had not really accepted myself and renounced the desire to be what I am not. So there's this idea that we are all somehow caught up in the web of desires to be what we are not. I don't know if we've discussed René Girard here today, but this notion of mimetic desire is something we often speak about, the respect in which we are drawn by the power, the imitative force, so to speak, of people and their desires around us. Guardini is precisely saying that that the beginning of self-acceptance means a certain letting go of all of these things, a certain cutting of the ties of all of these desires that take us really away from ourselves. Now, sort of two final episodes. The first has to do with the religious dimension of all of this. So Guardini goes on to say what perhaps all of us think in this room, or maybe you've been thinking in listening to this, that this task of accepting oneself in the end cannot be achieved on a purely ethical basis. He doesn't explore at length all the reasons why, and I think in part they may have to do with the fact that it may just be dissatisfactory for someone to believe in the end that they can't in natural terms sort of answer the question of who they are. And maybe in the case of the noble non-believer who is not given into despair, there might be a kind of sort of coming to terms with what one does know and doesn't know about oneself. But Guardini, in any case, believes that one has to move into the realm of faith and the relation to God to ultimately accept oneself. So he says here, I can only do so, that is to accept oneself, on the basis of something higher. And this brings us to faith. Faith in this context means that I understand my finitude in relation to the highest authority, namely the will of God himself. God is real and necessary. He is grounded in himself and requires no explanation. The explanation for God is himself. This God has created me. He is the one who gave me to myself. Questions thus cease. To say that God had created me to do this and that in the world, or because it is meaningful for there to be personal being, says not more but less than simply saying, because God willed for me to be. A fascinating idea that that no amount of even attribution of the various reasons that God would have created me that we can enumerate says more than simply to say, because God willed that I would be. Again, there's much in the essay, but I just want to get you through sort of to the final thought here. So this is how acceptance grounds growth, real growth. As I've been saying, the talk of acceptance can sound in some sense as a kind of tragic resignation to who we are, and that sort of deep aspirations in us have to be given up. And of course, there's a respect in which we have to live in a way that is true and realistic about ourselves. That seems to be the beginning of the Guardini point. But there's also a very deep understanding of the way in which this acceptance of self becomes the basis for inner growth, transformation, unfolding. So the paradigm case here is the idea of repentance, as analyzed by Guardini. And I'll read to you just a brief passage here. He says, repentance is one of the most powerful expressions of our freedom. In repentance, we judge ourselves and return to the side of goodness. Repentance cannot undo what has happened. Trying this would be a lie. The basis of repentance, rather, is the truth, namely the recognition that I really have done this or that. But this truth becomes the starting point of a new way of acting and thus takes on a new character. Our life is only definitive after we draw our last breath. Until then, everything that has happened in a person, from the worst to the best, can yet be changed by taking a new stance and drawing all the possible consequences. Our life then becomes what our basic stance makes it to be. None of this means that the repentant person throws himself away. As soon as he does so, he no longer repents, but despairs. So there would be so much more to say about this essay. I want to sort of end here in terms of the unpacking of Guardini, but just to show how, or just to end with a few reflections on the way in which this understanding of the acceptance of oneself is incredibly meaningful for a discussion of authenticity. So in some sense, you could say the acceptance of oneself as understood in the Guardinian way is somehow the fundamental moral attitude, the fundamental attitude with moral dimensions required for the kind of authenticity that we're discussing here. One can imagine all sorts of cases in which not to accept oneself would undermine an authentic existence. Think of the person who lives in self-rejection their whole life and seeks to give their life purpose and meaning in the roles they take on. Sometimes when those roles are particularly offensive, people like that are disparagingly referred to as posers, right? We all recognize such people in our society, but at a deeper level, there's probably a tendency towards posing in all of us, not necessarily in the way in which perhaps it takes sort of its most extreme expressions, maybe even pathological expressions in our culture, but nevertheless in the fact that we live behind a series of masks. And Guardini in this work doesn't analyze all the reasons for that, and it's not to say that it's as simple as knowing that I need to accept myself and then we transform ourselves and we live authentically. Guardini would agree with Kierkegaard that the moral life can't be reduced to a particular moment, that it is the accumulation of a whole life of commitment, and that it's rare that we have the opportunity to somehow make ourselves in one action. But nevertheless, the lack of this, the kind of alienation from oneself as one really is, would be, it seems to me, the basis of a profound inauthenticity. And at the same time, the acceptance of oneself, particularly in this faith-filled way in which one understands oneself to have been received from God, and one comes to peace also with the way I really am and not the way I want to be, which is something I'm sure we all struggle with. Those of us, the more high aspiring a person is, the more often they want what they aren't. They see in other people talents and abilities that they don't have. And so the risk of a kind of inauthenticity seems to be very much alive there. So I won't try to develop all that further, but I just want to sort of put, let's just say, a Guardinian account, which is so richly experiential, on the table for us to take into our considerations about authenticity. As you said before, it's practical, certainly in the sense that in Guardini you have immediately this feeling of how one might try to live in an authentic way. It reminds me of Van Hildebrand's tendency in his writings to punctuate many passages with the phrase tua res agitur, this concerns you. And in Guardini you always have the feeling of being addressed. But at the same time, we have something more than just practical here. I think we have in some sense perhaps a phenomenological effort to get to the very structure of our posture as creatures, perhaps, the way in which we receive and have our being, and the way in which that is the precondition for any other moral acting and authentic moral acting in our life. So, thank you very much.
Is everyone okay? No one needs a coffee? You can take, I'm going to start with a question here. And so let's first try to divide the audience. That's how all good talks start. So raise your hand if you consider yourself a millennial. If you're a millennial, come on. How about a baby boomer? It's a good amount, come on, it's okay. So what I want to develop here is kind of a social commentary on, I think, the incarnate ways that truth is transmitted through generations. And although it might be a little offensive to some of the millennials or the boomers here, I'm Gen Xer, so I won't criticize myself. And I think through this very human way, a search for what is authenticity, because you find these things lived through families and then through these generations, right? So we know that every generation pushes back against the last. I think this is particularly true now that history in some way, thanks to technology, social media and the like, has sped up in some ways that you can push back all the more. You know, maybe in the high medieval ages, you wore your pants a certain height and your dad didn't, and all of a sudden that was your big rebellion, right? So the pushback today is certainly a little more drastic than that. So we'll call the current generation the millennials, we'll call the past generation the boomers, and we'll leave John Henry and I aside. Now, the boomers did a lot of good, and certainly in the US at least, we've seen a huge cumulative increase in GDP, wealth, general well-being, and also opportunities, right? I mean, when I went to Steubenville here 20 years ago, it certainly wasn't as nice as today, right? So the actions of that generation certainly have had a cumulative positive benefit to all of us. But the GDP was bought, if you look at it more deeply, with debt. And a lot of that debt is coming due. And the well-being and opportunities were married to an unfettered freedom, which in some ways reaped a doubt of the past in a divorce from reality. Even fundamental human relationships, most pertinent to that word, divorce, that being marriage. The self-expression of the boomers replicated or replaced, rather, authenticity. You know, it kind of stained that word, pushing back against everything that prior generations represented. The self-expression, in my opinion, was a failure. And so the millennials are the children of this generation. They're a generation that comes from debt, doubt, and divorce. And that's how I would, in the negative sense, typify the boomers. And like all generations, the millennials are seeking a group identity. There's a group identity that exists as well. They're seeking something more than the plastic identity of their parents, and they're seeking what I think that the boomers lacked, which is authenticity. The boomers, I think if you ask a millennial, are kind of sellouts, right? And the kids are not all right. It's not good. So while the millennials know what and who to rebel against, they don't know what they're rebelling for, which is the real issue. So this lack of direction, this vacuum, is ironically filled, in the case of millennials, with inauthentic ways of being. Certain actions that work against nature and lead to a monoculture of behavior and ultimately sadness. And specifically, if you look at it, you just watch TV, politically, culturally, and on a behavioral level, they're falling back in to the inauthentic expressions of their parents. I think the best example of this is AOC, the politician from the Bronx, who I think has many good premises, but all of her conclusions are wrong. Socialism just doesn't work. We can talk about that offline. It just doesn't work. So when I talk to millennials and you pick apart some of AOC's arguments, care for the poor and social justice, they're there. But they're not quite there on the conclusion she makes, right? So you shouldn't give up on the millennials. They're not wholesale socialists, right? You shouldn't confuse the two. So you have to ask, are the millennials just falling into an authenticity trap? Are they just another pushback generation? Or are the millennials just the new baby boomers? And I don't think they are. You see, the boomers at least could rebel and still have the durable values of their parents, and their parents in many ways represented the accumulation of all these prior generations' values, right? So the boomers were able to experiment. They did some drugs. They went to Woodstock. That was probably awesome. I wish I would have been there. But they then had their parents to fall back on. And now they're grandparents, and they're like, yeah, I'm golfing. I'm kind of like my dad. However, the millennials have no such luck. Their grandparents are dead. Their great generation, they're dead. And their parents, although they're fine people, they lack, due to debt, doubt, and divorce, moral credibility. So what did they do? And where did they go? Well, let's look at their actions. This is particularly, I think this is really interesting. If you watch any reality TV show, you see a lot of home improvement shows. One is about tiny homes, right? And I think that love of tiny homes is actually a rejection of debt. When you talk to every single one of those, I don't talk to them, but when the host does, they claim in every instance that I don't want debt. I want to live in this like place I can afford within my means, kind of like my grandparents who I never met. It's interesting. And their failure to commit is a fear of divorce. My wife and I, we do this kind of pre-Cana thing. I live up in Connecticut. And in every instance, they're 28, 29, 30, they're not married yet. How long have you been engaged? We've been engaged for 7 years. We're trying to get the wedding just right. Seriously. But it really, when you really dig into it, it's that they don't want to get divorced. It's not a bad thing. And I think their constant pursuit of identity and authenticity is actually pushed back against doubt. I work in New York City, and there's rainbow flags everywhere in the month of June. And when you talk to some of these individuals, they want to have something real, something authentic, right? Against no doubt. So some in this generation then are moving ahead by going back to the prior generation's durable values, or because they didn't experience in an incarnate way their grandparents' example, they're just making it up, right? It'd be as if the whole world explodes and I leave my children blueprints to make a car. They would create a car, but it would look a little different, right? It would look a little different. Because what they fear ultimately is that they will lose without this authenticity, this identity, this flag to carry, is that they will lose their subjectivity, and it's who they are, and they're right. That is how you lose yourself. But I think for us, as philosophers and would-be saints, I hope, the search for personhood is a huge opening. When someone says, "Who am I, and what should I do, and where to whom shall we go?" that's big. That's the opening for us. This is where the objective, the divine, and the transcendent meets the millennials. Only by this pursuit can we provide them that true meaning. Where else will they go? It's then my contention that this generation, the millennials, will at once be both massively lost and massively religious and value motivated. There's an interesting, in C.S. Lewis, one of the space trilogies, one of the books, maybe the last one, he talks about Merlin, and he's like, how can you have Merlin? Like, you're a good guy, but you're a magician at the same time. That doesn't exist in the modern age. And it doesn't exist, he explains, because in the future, he says, good and evil will kind of come like 2 points, 2 needles, whereas in the past, they were kind of round, right? And Merlin could kind of stand on the good hill. But I think as I began with this quickening of history, the pushback is bigger. So too is the dichotomy of this generation, right? Very religious or very lost. And I think the very religious are those that at least have that that call inside of them that hasn't been obscured with actions that oppose the dignity of the human person. They will seek the authentic one. And that ultimately debt, doubt, and divorce cannot erase the source of authenticity, the source of authenticity, with a capital A. So what do we do? How do we then incarnate these values into this new generation? Because I think that's ultimately the pursuit of talking about ideas in the first place. And I think we do it the same way that we always do, and it's maybe something that my children would be able to tell you about, but maybe some of the rich and powerful have forgotten. And we do it through this. I was recently told by a very good friend of mine that Benedict said this once, but I don't remember reading it. He said that the gospel, and in this case the truth, authenticity, giving someone meaning, is performative and not just informative. So I think we do it through friendships and its best allies, which are truth, beauty, and goodness. And it's a lot of work. But ultimately, this is the work that we undertake as philosophers and would-be saints. So in conclusion, I have a lot of being a finance guy, very bullish on the millennials. And I noticed, Liz and I were talking this morning, that a lot of the young people I speak with, 25 to 35, if you give them just this kind of nudge, that the call for authenticity and that identity and the need to face he who is authentic is so strong that if you give them just a little push, they're there, right? And that's it. Hopefully I didn't offend any millennials or baby boomers. And if I did, John Henry will buy you drinks. That's it.
Thank you.